there's an area in the lower body that I see as consistently causing people issues in their ability to create meaningful change and range of motion and how they feel in their lower body. And until they address this area, they're going to continue to have those issues. There are very common circumstances in which I'll be working with someone and some measurements or some changes don't seem to be happening or sticking. And then I go, okay, it's probably this area. And once we address this, things really start to click into place and start working a lot better. And that area is the posterior hip capsule. The posterior hip capsule is this area where the femur needs to glide back within the hip socket when we move into an internally rotated position of the hip. So under normal internal rotation mechanics, this femur is going to slide back or posteriorly. There needs to be space in that back hip capsule for that to happen in the first place. So we could be doing all the internal rotation based work in the world, but until we address this area back here and open up space for the femur to get back there, then we're never going to be able to fully move into or acquire full hip internal rotation. And this is way more common on people's left sides than their right side. Because most people are right side dominant, and I have a lot more content specifically on this pattern, which I will link down below, people tend to have a bias towards leaning in the right side. And because of this, that right femur tends to be more internally rotated and the left tends to be more externally rotated or out. So this left posterior hip capsule tends to be less and less accessible over time as that femur stays in an externally rotated position. The way we would know this is if we have a hard time improving measurements that reflect the femur's ability to slide back in the hip socket. Those would be a straight leg raise, which after about 45 degrees turns into more of an internal rotation based movement of the femur, your actual femoral internal rotation, and an Ober's test, which is something you can't really test on yourself, but is a reflection of how well your femur can internally rotate and adduct. So there's three common options I use as posterior hip capsule releases. I'm going to be showing you them in order of difficulty, but some are going to work for some people. The first one's usually going to work the best, but if it doesn't, there are two other alternatives that can have really great results for those people because they just need a slightly different variation of it. But I would definitely start with this first one because it is the lowest risk of aggravating your hip because it is in the lowest amount of hip bend, and that's really important for some people because if you're going to move more and more into hip flexion or hip bend, at some point you have to pass through internal rotation, which is after about 60 degrees of hip flexion, you begin to move more towards internal rotation. So if you can't internally rotate your hip, you're probably going to feel pretty pinchy or something's not going to feel quite right within that hip itself. Now, because this is such a common problem, getting this posterior hip capsule stretch to open is an important consideration and something I address in my beginner body restoration program. So if you're looking for exercises that complement these stretches and the ability to own that hip capsule once it's open and be able to create long-term results, check out that program I will link down below. We're going to start with 1 foot on the book, the side we're going to stretch out. And that book is about 2 inches thick. I wouldn't go much more than that. And we have a pull in the opposite side hand, the right hand for stabilization. But first, start in the neutral stance and then get your right foot or the opposite side foot. The heel of that foot is going to be in line with the toes of the side you're going to stretch out. So that'd be the left side. And now you're going to slightly bend both knees, okay? Do a little posterior pelvic tilt. So if your pelvis was a bowl of water, you don't want it spilling out the front. You want it spilling out the back just a little bit. And now what you want to do is get heavy on your back heel, your left heel. And keeping your hand on this hip, just push your hips back and off to the side on that side. And you should feel a little stretch in the back of your left hip. Not like a muscular stretch as much as it is a bony sort of stretch. It's kind of hard to describe, but you'll know what I mean when you get it right here in this lower butt cheek. You can take that other side arm with the pull, reach it forward, and then you can just really sink into it. It's going to depend on the individual how deep you get into this stretch. For some people, where Trevor is going to be enough. For other people, they need to get into it a little bit more and push those hips back like that. The goal is, though, is just to get to the most shallow point where you feel that hip capsule stretch and then just hang out there for breaths, focusing on that back heel without losing the front of your foot and toes curling up. Keep the whole foot flat. but the heel is where you're focusing your weight. Now, the biggest problem we're gonna see on this exercise is people are going to, yes, be on that back heel, but their hips are gonna twist to the other direction like that. So what's really key here is that we get the pelvic tilt first, and then we shift over to that side. So the hips are going back and over to that side. Do you see how his outside hip is outside of his knee on that side? That's the goal. So that will allow you to feel a stretch right in there, which is where you should feel it. The other common mistake is people are going to turn this into more of a squat and get too deep into it rather than more of a hinge. So they're going to do this, and that's too much knee bend. So get a little bit of knee bend, but focus more on the hips going back a little bit. Right there is generally where we want to be. The only other thing to keep in mind is don't overreach it and try to do a maximal stretch. It's just like, can you get like a 5 out of 10 stretch there and hang out? That's all you need. More is not better here. Don't feel any weird stuff in your traps or your shoulders. Just a gentle reach, sit back in that hip and stay there for a couple of minutes. This is the standing supported right step around with right quadratus laborum stretch and right apical expansion from Postural Restoration Institute. What we're going to do here is really stretch out the left posterior hip capsule stretch in a sort of interesting setup here. So what we're going to do is get a PVC pipe or a dowel. Really anything you can hold on to is totally fine. Even a door frame can work. And what we want to do is cross our right leg across so we form this perfect T shape. So we have our left toes kind of going into our right foot arch right there. And if we're doing that, that means we are going to push our left hip back. So what we want to do now is lean on the left heel. Keep most of your body weight on the left side. Keep your left knee mostly locked out as you round your back and reach for your right toes with your left arm. All the while you are supporting yourself with the right hand on the dowel. Again, your weight should be mostly in your left heel. And if you're doing it right, you're gonna feel a nice stretch in your glute area in the hip capsule right about here. And we're just gonna sit here and breathe in through our nose, out through our mouth. And as we exhale through our mouth, might be able to get a little bit closer to our foot with that left hand. But again, stay relaxed. Let's show you from a back view because I think it's really helpful to see kind of how the hips are set up from this angle. So again, make a perfect T, or to the extent that you can make that T. Some people can't get it totally crossed over, but if it's close, it's probably good enough. Just do the best you can without it being painful or uncomfortable. And then make sure you keep your back rounded and then just reach down, left arm to right toes. And as you can see, the left hip is back relative to the right, and the hips are kind of just slightly turned to an axis where it's facing the left side. For our friends who are vertically gifted and they have very long legs, then we can use a step or something about 2 to 3 to 4 inches tall, and we can just do the same exact thing. Again, this isn't for everyone, but for people who have longer limbs, this can be helpful. We want to keep that left leg straight, but Trevor doesn't have super long legs, so his knee is going to be a little bit more bent here. But for longer limb people, this could be helpful. What we're going to do here is start in an all fours position with our hands underneath our shoulders and our knees underneath our hips. And we're going to initiate this by hooking this knee around that back knee right there. So we're trying to stretch the left hip in this instance, so we're gonna hook the right knee behind the left knee. And then what we're gonna do is bring our left elbow to our left knee like that, and we're gonna reach the right arm, actively slide it overhead as much as we can to our end range without feeling any discomfort whatsoever. So right now in this position, he should feel a stretch in his back left hip capsule right here. It should be pretty noticeable. It's not like a muscular stretch. It's more of a bony stretch, if that makes sense. And now what we're going to do, we're going to inhale through our nose and reach our right arm away from us and exhale through our mouth and slightly reach our right leg back. That's going to intensify the stretch in this back left hip right here. As he exhales, you might feel a little bit of left side abs. He's going to do it again. Inhale, reach. Exhale, reach that right leg just a couple of inches back at a time. You don't want to go too fast. You want to just tempo it, go a couple of inches at a time. So you never want to feel the front of your hip or the side of your hip really. You want to feel it primarily in the back. Especially if you're feeling it in the front of the hip, you're probably going too far. So make sure that you're only feeling it right here. And you can ensure you're doing that by not overextending yourself really. So make sure your back isn't arching. There's a nice little round to it a little bit. Slight tuck of the hips, if you will. And also, if you can't reach that right arm further forward overhead, or you can't reach this right leg back anymore, that's fine. Just maintain that position and just breathe and relax and then melt into that position.